Good evening, everyone. Good evening. If I can just have your attention, I promise only for a couple minutes. It's really wonderful to see you all here. Thanks for being here. I realized I didn't introduce myself when I was yelling at you earlier. My name is, well, you do. My name is Rick Locke. I have the great pleasure to serve as Provost here at Brown, and I'm a professor of political science and international public affairs. And I want to thank you all for being here at this academic year's first by faculty, for faculty lecture. And like all the other talks that we've had in this series, and this is a series that started in the, I guess, winter of 2015, 2016, we had an overwhelmingly positive response. And as you can see, I mean, it's just so wonderful to come into a room and see it filled with people and sort of feel the energy, and people are really engaged. The idea behind the series is that there is tremendous interest on campus for us to have more occasions to come together and learn about one another's work. That when you bring together people to talk about substance, it's a very different energy and engagement than when you have them talk about, let me tell you about the other things I talk about, budget or space or disciplinary issues. I can tell you that the energy is really different when we're talking about these. And with each speaker, I think I'm truly reminded, and I hope those of you who've been to several of these, I'm reminded of how fortunate I feel, and I hope all of you feel, to be at Brown. We have just an exceptional group of faculty doing amazing work, and doing this work in a way that not only is pushing the envelope in terms of knowledge creation, but is also making an impact in the world. And I think that combination and the style with which it's being done is really exceptional. And the whole idea behind this series is to showcase that work and to bring people together from very different disciplines who may not understand all the fundamentals of physics as tonight, or we had a few other lectures. It could be comparative lit theory or things like that. But the exceptional, but that people come together and start, sharing and talking about it and building this community, which is really, really wonderful. And tonight is a very special night, because we'll be hearing from Professor Sylvester James Gates, otherwise known as Jim, who came to Brown last year through this new program that we had launched called the Provost Visiting Professors Program. And this was a program that we launched, last year. We envisioned it the year before, which was basically to try to create opportunities for senior faculty to come and spend some time with us. And the hope is that if they came here and saw this incredible community, got to engage with our students, we learned a little bit about them, they learned a little bit more about us, they would choose to stay. Fortunately, it has worked with Jim. And in the process, and I think I had 18 months of intense conversations with Jim Gates about please stay. What happens is you develop friendships and not just colleagueships. And that's really exceptional. You really get to know people, and you get to know them as full people, and you see not only what they're going to contribute to the academic enterprise here on campus, but how they're going to strengthen the kind of community that I think is so special here at Brown. Let me just, I'm not going to go into a long biography. You have that on that little handout, but Professor Gates is the Ford Foundation Professor of Physics here at Brown, and also has an appointment in mathematics. Prior to his appointment, he was the Distinguished University Professor, University Regents Professor, and the John H. Toll Professor of Physics, and the Director of the Center for Particle and String Theory at the University of Maryland. Prior to teaching at Maryland, he taught at MIT and was also a member of Harvard's very prestigious Society of Fellows program. He's a recipient of the National Medal of Science, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a fellow of both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Physical Society. He has also served, and he gave a great talk about this last spring at the Watson Institute. He served as a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology during the Obama administration. Tonight we'll hear from Jim, but we have other people who actually gave talks in this series, Glenn and David. Diane's going to be giving a talk in this series as well. I'm not sure if I'm missing anyone else who already spoke, but it's really a terrific series. And so thank you all for coming here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Gates.
Well, Rick, thank you for that invitation. As most of you came into the room, I was standing there playing the role of host, and I'm sure you thought I was probably the butler, as opposed to tonight's speaker. But it was a great pleasure to, for the first time, get a chance to shake hands with most of the people in this room. There were a few of you that I missed, but I thought it was very important that I have a chance to actually touch the flesh, so to speak, of the faculty that I now share such collegial feelings with. As Rick mentioned, I was here last year as a visiting professor, and I fell in love with this community. I'm going to be quite frank with you. I just finished 33 years at another university, University of Maryland, College Park, as Rick mentioned, and I had a 12-hour retirement. I officially retired from the University of Maryland on June the 30th, and my contract here at Brown officially started July the 1st. So for all of 12 hours, I had no means of support at all. Now, you might think that that would be very worrisome for someone to not have a position that provides you remuneration and support for your life, but I slept through most of that period. So it wasn't a concern that I had, especially that I didn't have a job for 12 hours. But fortunately, I was able, like a cat, to land on my feet. I want to thank Rick, first of all, for, boy, this guy blew me away the first time I met him. I was amazed walking into his office and hearing him quote my own quotes back to me from a commencement speech I had given in St. John's, Newfoundland within the last year. And so I'm like, what kind of provost does that? So that was my first meeting with your provost, and now my provost. And I have to tell you, I've only met one other person in high office that does that sort of thing. The other person's name is Barack Obama, because he did something similar on the occasion when I was presented with the National Medal of Science. He made a comment about a kid dreaming of becoming a scientist living on an army base. And I later got a chance to look at the written version of that speech, and that comment is not there. So this is something by some means or another, maybe magic, legerdemain, who knows, but he was able to find out about me, and so you share good company. So let's get started, because I'm told I have 30 minutes, and boy, do we have a distance to go. So let me end my little light show here, and let's get started. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is thank you for the introduction, Rick. As you were going through it, I started to get a little bit nervous, because this happens to me. Tonight was actually mercifully short, but many times I go to places and people beforehand say, send us a document so that we can make some comments to introduce you appropriately. So I have a document that's about 2.5 pages long, and what I tell people is just pick out a few things that the audience would be interested in hearing. And I can't tell you the number of times people have tried to read the entire document. Now, on one occasion, and this is a joke some of you have probably heard before, on one occasion I was sitting next to a friend, and this was going on, and the speaker's going on, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I wish they would just stop. And my friend leans over and says, you know, Jim, we've all heard of a man that needs no introduction, but that's an introduction that needs no man. And so that was brought back to me tonight as Rick first said, you have the bio, but then he began to work his way through it. I was like, oh God, another one of those occasions. So let's get started. So, will evolution and information theory provide the fundamentals of physics? Is the title of my talk. And this is a very sort of strange talk because it's actually very serious and yet it's very odd. I'm going to start by telling you that back when Isaac Newton liberated physics from natural philosophy, because most people don't know that physics is a unique piece of science that started off as a piece of philosophy. And it actually was with the action of Newton that it actually became a science. And basically what Newton did is tell us that things move along what we physicists call the classical path. And it's very deterministic. It's like if a car is traveling at 30 miles an hour, where is it going to be in 1 hour? 30 miles away from where you are. Where's it going to be in half an hour? It's going to be 15 miles. It's very deterministic. You can predict where things are going to be. That's what Newton gave us. But there's something called quantum mechanics in the world. The way that electrons move is nothing at all like classical motion. And so you see a little image of Einstein down here in the corner because you see he is, first of all, he was one of the strongest critics about quantum mechanics. He never fully accepted it, but it would have never come into existence without his own work. So he is both a critic and a creator of quantum mechanics, a very odd role. And so the world of electrons is this jagged, motions are almost unpredictable. You have to do with probabilities and what have you, so it's a different world. And you can compare the two. Boy, the deterministic world is easy to think about. It's in accord with our daily experience. It gives us a view of life that we try to extend to the universe. But if you're trying to build one of these things, you got to actually use quantum mechanics. I tell people all the time, if you don't believe in quantum mechanics, you shouldn't use this. Because it's just filled with quantum mechanics. And it is. The way that we build these things is using the laws of quantum mechanics. So, the universe to me looks like this. It's a bunch of particles. Now, I look out at an audience like this, I often like to say, you're much more pretty to look at than this list. But in fact, for my work, what we do is we study particles. We study things like the electron, quarks, things that are smaller than atoms. And this is a list of all of them. And I won't run you through this list because this is not, in fact, a physics course tonight. A few years ago, we added one. We called it the Higgs boson, which you may have heard of. It won a Nobel Prize. The announcement came actually on July the 4th. I like to say the Higgs particle was born on the 4th of July. So there's stuff beyond the Higgs model. Beyond the standard model. That whole collection of things is called the standard model. It's the best tested piece of science that humanity has ever constructed. There are parts of the mathematics associated with the table that I just showed you that have been tested to better than 1 part in a billion. And calculated with the mathematical laws that describe it, also to better than 1 part in a billion, and they agree. There's something called the magnetic moment of the electron, which I'm talking about in particular, and it's the best tested piece of science humanity has ever come up with. Most people have never heard of this, nor have they heard of the standard model, but that's why people like me and some of our scientific friends, why we're pretty sure that we know what we're talking about, because nature keeps confirming for us that we really do know what we're talking about, even with the probabilities of quantum mechanics involved. In fact, you need those probabilities to get the agreement between observation and the calculations. So in 1973, I was much younger. My hair was, sometimes I show people pictures of me with my hair when I was very young, because I have always enjoyed my hair, even to this stage of life. But when I was young, it was huge, it was dark, it was black. There are pictures of me online. You can see how much fun I had with my hair. I had an afro when I was a Cal Tech that would kill anybody. In fact, Richard Feynman commented to me one day about my afro. So anyhow, so in '73, when I was a graduate student at MIT, I was trying to figure out how to build a successful academic career. And I was looking around, and we were trying to write research papers on areas where even faculty were already working. And I thought, that's not a fair competition. Those guys, and it was mostly guys, those guys have been doing this stuff for 15 and 20 years, and here I'm a little puny graduate student, and I'm supposed to write something that's comparable to what they do? And so I decided that that was not a prescription for success. And accordingly, what I did is I started making big lists of everything that was going on in the field, and I found this subject that was 2 years old. It's called supersymmetry. It had been developed actually behind the Iron Curtain. We in the West didn't know it because that was happening around 67, 68. But in the West, we rediscovered this mathematics around 1972. So by 75, when I was in graduate school and looking around, there was this new subject out there, and I immediately recognized that it was likely to be something extraordinarily important for the future of theoretical physics. Now, it was odd because I was at MIT. I was working in the Center for Theoretical Physics, and I could not convince anyone that this subject had legs, that it was going to be important for the future. And so as a consequence, I wound up writing the first PhD thesis on the subject of supersymmetry at MIT, which I submitted in 1977. This is the cover page you're looking at. What's supersymmetry? Well, back to the particles. So when you look in the mirror, you don't see this, but I do. So the way we, people like me, look at the totality of our reality is that it can be understood in terms of particles. There are things like the electron, which you see illustrated here by the symbol E, and it has a whole bunch of friends. We call them leptons. Inside of nuclear matter, there are things called quarks, up and down quarks. They're kind of like the electron, so that's why you put them in that little box down there. And then there are things that keep all of these particles in fixed shapes. We call them forces, like the force of gravity, the electromagnetic force. But each force actually has a set of carriers associated with it. And that's what you see in the box up here. So this particular arrangement is made to emphasize a point. When you go horizontally in this table, what you're looking at are things, whether they are the carriers of forces, so everything in the top row is a carrier force. Everything in the bottom row is something that is subject to the force. So that's a distinction that we can make in nature. On the other hand, when you look vertically, you look to see a very strange property that we know about. That is, if you take two flashlights and aim them at right angles to each other, they can pass right through each other. And you can do that experiment in a dusty room and actually watch it happen. If you take two electrons and aim them right at each other, they don't pass right through. And so these two columns denote whether they pass through, that's this column, or whether they don't. Now, we humans are perhaps genetically coded to appreciate symmetry. So my question is that very symmetrical? If you say yes, please leave the room. That's not symmetrical by any easy definition that I can think of. And so this particular division of our reality is what we've gotten in our science over the course of the last couple of hundred years. We say the universe looks like this. It's not very symmetrical. And yet we've learned symmetry is an extraordinarily important property of nature. So suppose nature looks like that. That's what I realized when I was a graduate student, that this new idea of supersymmetry said that nature could be much more symmetrical. As you can look at this table, it has a right-left symmetry now. Now, the way that it gets there is this is what we see in the laboratory. These are things that we see only in the mathematics, but like the Higgs boson, people like me say, if you do enough experiments, you'll find these things. We call them super partners, or supermatter, or super energy. So I'm going to now, we're going to go to a very dark place now. Please don't take out the holy water, and please don't grab for crucifixes. We're going to do a little bit of math. So the way that physicists look at the universe, talking about these particles, is we look at differential equations. Because that's basically what Isaac Newton taught us, is that differential equations, which he invented because he invented differential calculus, that differential equations are extraordinarily important to try to understand nature. I like to say we physicists ought to call ourselves, say we're part of a company called Equations Are Us, because that's what we do. And it's not just us, it's social science. Anyone who uses differential equations to make predictions about the way the world works, you're paying homage to this great discovery of Newton. So in my part of physics, we got equations that look like this, we got equations that look like this, got equations like that. Okay, you can now let go of your crucifix. So those equations are the things that people like me study to try to understand how the structure of the universe works. And so there's a problem in my field that's never been studied. And when I was a postdoc at Harvard, I made a journey out to Caltech at the invitation of a guy named John Schwartz. And we tried to solve one of these differential equations. And it turns out we couldn't. And in the 40 years since I made that journey, no one has solved the particular equations that we tried to solve. So when I was in the 90s, when I was already a full professor, I didn't quite have an endowed chair, but I was confident that I didn't care that my colleagues thought I was crazy. Because if there's a problem out there that hasn't been solved in 40 years, you have to be crazy to think you can solve it. But yet, I decided that I was, they weren't going to kick me out. I had tenure. And so that's what tenure is all about, right? Tenure is to give you the freedom to identify problems that you think are important and not be swayed by your colleagues from pursuing those problems. So around 95, 96, I started doing this on this kinds of problem. And what we found was kind of weird. This picture is something that came to us from Albert Einstein. It's something called the light cone. It tells you that your reality is actually split into a couple of pieces. One piece we call the future. That's where we're in the upper cone. There's another piece we call the past. That's everything in the lower cone. And then all this stuff out here is sometimes referred to as the else when. That is, it's somewhere else, it's some when else. It's not accessible to us. That's what relativity teaches us about the nature of reality. So I used this device and looked at the equations. And so it's like passing a material object through a kind of a sieve. Or if you think of the biological analogy, imagine taking a living creature and rendering until you get to its DNA, right? So there's a process by which you go from a very complicated structure to a guiding underlying structure. And the picture I showed you allows me to do that to the mathematics. So this is an invention that I realized, and with my friends, we found that those differential equations turn into pictures. Now, this is just a toy model of the process. So I have to teach students. So, you don't teach students running at a full gallop. You teach them first how to walk. And so what I'm showing you here is sort of teaching them how to walk, that the equations on the right-hand side of this image contain all the information about the derivative equations on the right-hand side of the image is all encoded in the structure of the graph on the left-hand side. And we were stunned in 2006 when I and a colleague named Michael Fox realized that this was possible. Now, there's a table in the middle of the room which is mostly occupied by mathematicians and two nice people like Maud and her husband. And earlier, I actually commented to my friends that it was probably the smartest table in the room. And that's because of Maud and her husband. But these days, I talk far more to mathematicians than I talk to physicists, so I don't mind ribbing them. I hope they appreciate this because, mathematicians typically learn mathematics from others, mathematicians. Physicists learn mathematics from nature. We have the smarter teacher. So in pursuing the study of nature, we often have to invent new mathematical concepts. Now, we don't invent the math the way that they would like it invented. It's not with the kind of logical rigor that is the pristine nature of real mathematics. We kind of fly by the seat of our pants with our mathematical intuition, and we come up with weird ideas like these pictures that I'm showing you. Every mathematician that I've ever talked to tells me that this kind of picture has never existed in the mathematical literature. There are similar graphs. There's a whole area of mathematics called graph theory, but not graph theory with the attributes of these things. So these things are kind of like little pieces of macrame that you can play with them. And what I just did, by the way, was a derivative. I'll go back to the beginning. Oops, sorry. So I started with this picture. I'm now going to perform a derivative. The technology is not helping here. There we go. Now I'm differentiating. I tell students, wouldn't it be great if all you had to do was move beads in the core calculus class to get an A? Because that's what I've just done. And it turns out that the actions that I've shown you in these diagrams, when encoded in terms of mathematics, that really was a derivative that I just took of the function that I called h, the one that lifted up. I took its derivative because the effect of our passing these equations to that strange cone is it encodes integration and differentiation by the raising and lowering of beads. The set of equations that I get afterwards are slightly different. Now, this name Adinkra comes from West Africa. It comes from the Ashanti people in West Africa, from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, if I remember my ethnology correctly. And why this name? Well, when I started this research, it was with a colleague. He was in the Czech Republic. I was in Georgia, a couple of hundred miles north of Tehran, not the state, but the country. And by the time we finished this work of understanding how to turn equations into pictures, I was in West Africa. And I think it was my first visit in West Africa. I was in the country of Mali at the time. And my colleague, who's a European American named Michael Fox, had been to Africa at least a decade before I had ever set foot on the continent. And he knew about this tradition in West Africa called adinkras, which are symbols that have hidden meanings. They're aphorisms. And so we were looking for a name for these pictures. And we went through a few things, and since I was in West Africa, I said, well, we should give it an African name. What could be more fun than that? And so Michael came up with this name, and so I like to tell people, well, we acted in typical colonial fashion. This is what the first set of equations looks like when you render it as a picture. This is what the second set of equations looks like when you render it as a picture. And this is the third set. Now, looking at those, you would say, gee, they kind of all look alike to me. Whereas if you started with the differential equation I started, they were actually very different. One of those sets of equations described the photon. Another one of the equations I first showed you described kind of half an electron. And the third set of equations I showed you in string theory describes part of gravity. And so in the initial place where I was working, they're very different things. And yet after passing them through this funny figure, they all have this same form. So how's the information stored there? Because the people in computer science are used to the idea of compressions, where you take some protocol, you use it on a data stream, and the thing that you get out contains the information that was there initially, but somehow encoded with a lot less bits. And that's what these pictures are doing. These pictures, by the way, can come in extraordinarily more complicated versions. So here are some. I'm just taking you through a selection. And these are differential equations, folks. We're looking at the equations rendered through this process. This is my favorite set. I've often said that if anyone knows someone who weaves, I'd like to get some wall hangings that look like this. And it turns out these things are related to, now the other part is the way these things are built, because after we built them, we then understood and we went to explore what are the mathematical rules that lead to these objects. And it turns out there's a very defined set of mathematical rules. And here I want to pay tribute to my colleague, Charles Duran, who's sitting at that table that is lifted up by Maud and her husband. And Chuck and I have been working together for about a decade on these things, and I talk to mathematicians far more than I talk to physicists these days. And one of the things that we discovered in our collaboration is that these funny pictures have bits encoded in them. Bits, strings of ones and zeros, just like in computer science. They're automatically there. We didn't put them there. They're there because of the equations that you start off describing nature, passing them through Einstein's funnel, and then getting to the pictures. So these things have bits. And then we made a further discovery. First of all, the bits are there because it turns out these things topologically, let me speak a little bit more precise for my mathematical colleagues. All of these diagrams start off being related to the topology of n-dimensional cubes. And so if you start off with an n-dimensional cube, you can name the vertices using bits. And so that's where the bit-centric structure arises in these things. So we've been studying these for a while. I remember when I first started doing this, I started getting very nervous because when I was young, there was a very famous physicist by the name of John Wheeler who had been Feynman's advisor in the 40s. And Wheeler was known to come up with extraordinarily crazy ideas. One of his ideas was called it from bit. Namely, the whole universe arises from some kind of digital infrastructure. As a young student, I thought he was crazy. But I wasn't the only one. Thorne was reputed to have, Kip Thorne, who just, by the way, won the Nobel Prize this year, a few days ago. Kip Thorne was in conversation with Feynman at some point in the 60s, and Thorne and Feynman had both been Wheeler students. And so Thorne was saying, Wheeler's crazy. And Feynman said, well, this guy sounds crazy, but what people of your generation don't know is that he's always sounded crazy. But when I was a student, I discovered that if you take one of his crazy ideas and unwrap it like the layers of an onion, you find out that after lifting off the layers, at the heart of the idea, you will often find a powerful kernel of truth. And then Feynman went on to explain that this is how he got his Nobel Prize, because one day he was in the office with Wheeler, and Wheeler said, do you think that the antiparticles of the electron could be an electron moving backwards in time? And if you know something about the details of quantum field theory, you know that's exactly what Feynman used to win a Nobel Prize. So it's a crazy idea, but that's the powerful kernel of truth. So I concluded that if you do theoretical physics when you're young, you can see crazy ideas, but you do it long enough and you too can go crazy. So here's a more complicated one of these diagrams. So I'm going to do a lot of I'm going to do some matrix algebra. And at this point, of course, I'm doing integrals. Lifting with derivatives, lowering must be integrals. I'm doing 4 integrals here. Again, I just would love it if a calculus class was taught this way. I'm going to do some more integrals. There we go. You see there are 2 identical subcells here. So the question is, are these 2 things the same or different? Is one the reflection of the other? That's the question. And so again, working with Chuck back, I think around 2008, what we figured out is that one of these cells on one side could be the reflection of the other, that they were not 2 independent subcells, but they're connected to each other. And all the motions that you see in my film are showing how you deform the objects, because I use the word topology, so it's not really the shape, it's the connections that are important. You smash it together, and you find out that the thing that we started with really did contain only one of these subcells. But the most peculiar thing about that, I told you that there are bits in this, 1s and 0s. Well, it turns out that the folding of this object is controlled by error correcting codes. Now, people in computer science know what error correcting codes are. The rest of us are simple beneficiaries of error correcting codes. Every day when you go to the ATM and you slip your card into that slot and you put your numbers in, if you put the wrong number in, the machine instantly tells you you're wrong. And the reason it does that is because there are actually error correcting codes built into the what's the word I'm looking for? Thank you. Of ATM, thank you, for how the ATM actually recognizes your card. That's why it's so instantly fast that it knows that you're wrong, because when you type the numbers in wrong, you don't fit into a pattern of an error correcting code. Now, error correcting codes are known in computer science, and so what in the world are they doing in the equations describing reality? This is the question I began asking myself shortly after Chuck and I and a group of our colleagues found these things. And I started thinking broadly, and the only place in natural science I know where error correcting codes are discussed is in genetics. Because there's been a long debate in genetics that a genome likely has an error correcting code in it because it suppresses wild sets of mutation while allowing some mutation. And so it suppresses the dead ends that might come out of a rampant reproduction of a genome. And therefore, people in evolutionary biology argue that error-correcting codes confer an advantage on genomes that possess them. And so I began to wonder, could it be that the error-correcting codes that we see in these equations describing the universe, could it be that we live in a universe that was the successful survivor of a mathematical equivalent of evolution? Now, I don't know that that's the case, and I won't go through details, but that's part of what we're doing. We also have bumped into like a genome, genotype to phenotype mapping problem. And in this regards, I have to pay tribute to one of our young to-be colleagues here at Brown University, Dr. Brandon Agbagnu, who's sitting here being embarrassed at the table. But he and I have actually been discussing this matter for about 6 months about, are there things that occur in evolutionary biology that provide models for understanding what the problem is that we're wrestling with in fundamental physics? And so, is there some kind of do we live in a universe where, let me just skip this. Do we live in a universe where you should think of these things as genes, and then the kind of mathematics that you use in genomics could be relevant for unraveling this physics problem? So last summer, I wrote a paper, not this summer, but the previous summer, I wrote a paper with 4 undergraduates where we did over 1 billion calculations to try to unravel a problem about phenotype to genotype matching, but not real phenome and not real genomes, but this mathematical structure. And so we were able to find that there's something like an overlap function, that when you have these graphs, you should think of those as pictures of a genome. And so there are mathematical, if you think of them as networks, you can extract their properties as networks. And then you can ask the questions, are there overlaps between different ones of these things? And what we found is that We studied 36,864 of these objects. And you want to know, could they overlap with 36,864? That's where this calculation comes up to 1,358,954. I'm sorry, 1,358,954,496 calculations. Fortunately, we have these things called computers that can actually do that stuff. And we found that a pattern that I had suspected would be there is actually confirmed by the calculations. So the initial calculations are in four-dimensional physics. Again, this is just a bunch of jargon for you folks to look at. It's eye candy for me. But you can display this data graphically. And so this is a subset of our calculations on a 96 by 96 grid. We didn't put this pattern here, by the way. It just was the output for the calculations. We also found other strange mathematical objects lurk in these equations. So I'm going to end now, because the question that I am now facing is, did reality begin with an inchoate epoch? What does that mean? Well, the standard picture of the Big Bang looks like this. There was this thing called the Big Bang. It created our universe, which was dark for a very long time until you got the first stars turning on. Later, the universe continues to cool, and you get the formation of galaxies and more complicated structures until finally planetary formation, solar system type formation, planetary formation at the same time going on, and then finally, we're at the end of that chain. That's the standard way that the way our universe came about. And so, for me, the question is, now that I found these structures that I think of as like DNA, that may have been subject to a process like evolution, could it be that this simple story that we have about how the universe came into existence, could it have an added complication at its beginning? So if we take DNA as an analogy, I would, and we know a lot about DNA. One of the things that I just gave a lecture a couple of days ago to my students talking about how DNA lets us as a species understand how we're all connected to each other using archaeological type approaches to studying DNA population distributions. So we know how we're related. And to me, this is one of the greatest stories in science, because our philosophers and our people of faith for thousands of years have said we are all brothers and sisters. And now we have a bunch of scientists say, well, not only are we brothers and sisters, I can tell you which house we all lived in together. To me, this is an amazing power of science and talks about the unity of what we are as a species. So DNA studies, ACGT, the four base pairs study, we think we have found the analogy. And so could it have been that mathematics, that this inchoate universe, where there are lots of possible mathematics laws for the universe, could that have come into existence and then a process like natural selection have picked out the laws that had a genome with error-correcting codes built into it? Because if it did, that's why we're seeing the remnant of those error-correcting codes in the equations that underlie supersymmetry. Thank you. Sure. Yes, sir.
Biologist.
Yes, he's blowing my cover. Biology.
Okay.
By the way, first of all, that's a left-handed helix up there in the last slide. DNA is a right-handed helix.
That's right. Just blow me out like that. Okay. I'll correct that slide next time.
Very good. But here's the question. I'm very curious as to whether or not the idea about an error-correcting universe and some sort of natural selection taking place is a question to which cosmology can provide an answer, and in particular, the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going up very, very soon, we hope. Is that going to see far back enough to help you out?
No, it won't, but that's a great question, so let me address the question as a whole. So one of the things about the formation of the universe, which cosmologists have talked about for a very long time, is it appears that our universe was created in a low entropy state. And that's kind of counterintuitive, because you would have expected the universe to be highly highly disordered and therefore not a low entropy state. So if it's true that the universe was created in low entropy state, you have to wonder what mechanisms would have driven it to that beginning. And my suspicions, I don't know quite how to make this a clean scientific argument, but my intuitions are that if you have something like supersymmetry, which imposes order, it might have contributed to that low entropy state. Yes, sir.
You talk about an error correcting code. There's sort of a sweet spot between too much error correcting, in which case there's no evolution, versus no error correcting, in which there's total chaos and everything falls apart.
Right.
And Dan Weinreich works on the evolution rotation rates.
Yeah.
So how does math help us deal with this problem? If you get the right sweet spot, evolution is really good. But if you have total error correction, there's no evolution, there's no life.
Right, and I agree, and I hope I alluded to that in my comments, that error correction, you don't want absolute error correction, because then there's no mutation, and then it's essentially a static system that doesn't evolve. How does math help us understand that? I don't know the answer to that question, because I'm actually a student now of principles of evolutionary genetics and biology. I would defer that to other people in the audience. And in fact, your colleague probably knows more about how to answer that question than I do. But it's a great question, and it's the kind of thing that I'm planning to wrestle with now that I'm here at Brown, where there are colleagues that are interdisciplinary enough that they'll let a physicist come over. Let me take the question over here. Yes, sir?
Can you say something about what the physical units are that the error correcting code is acting on? Like, what are the base pairs of?
Sure. So when I showed you those diagrams, those adinkras, in the language of mathematicians, what they would tell you is that those are representations of orbits of generators of a symmetry group. And so where we have seen this, the action of these error correcting codes is in the determination of the links in those pictures, because those links are the orbits. So the error correcting codes have to act on the links. Yes, sir?
Do you have a conjecture about what the selection mechanism or the
Oh,
selection
that's a great question. This is something that I will be talking with a soon-to-be Brown colleague over the course of the next year. We actually do have some preliminary ideas about what might drive this selection, but it's certainly premature to talk about that. But that's a great question. Yes, sir.
I'm not quite clear as to how many sacred cows you are throwing to the dogs. In other words, we accept that the calculations are subject to evolution, but are you also throwing the basic particles to the dogs?
Yes, I am, in a sense. Because the throwing to the dogs part is, are the error correcting codes so powerful that they actually determine not just the links but the nodes? And in fact, we know that there's a relationship between the nodes and the links in these diagrams. And these nodes, in fact, are the particles. They represent the particles. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
I love this idea of using Einstein's funnel to convert a differential equation that we
Thank
don't
you.
really feel to these diagrams
Thank
that
you.
have all of this information in them. But I wonder, like, when you have this diagram, what does it mean when it's longer or it has more points? And how does the differential equation actually relate to the diagram?
So let me go back, because this is a semi-technical question, but it's one that I can answer using the toy version of this process that I showed you, which was implicit in this diagram. So the point is the following. Each of these nodes represents a function. So this is the function phi1. This is the function phi2. And if you look over in my differential equations, you see that I have two functions, phi1 and phi2. The dark nodes represent functions also. But remember when I showed you my table that there were some things that pass through each other and other things that don't? The things that pass through each other are the white nodes. The things that don't pass through each other are the black nodes. And so the way that, as I said, this is a toy for understanding a basic idea, because this diagram is actually too simple to describe four-dimensional physics, but it has the principles that we use to look at these objects. And so the idea would be that these things might be something like a wave function for a photon, whereas these things here would describe the wave function of something similar, perhaps, to an electron. Yes.
So you presented this really beautiful analogy. Do you know yet what kind of experimental data you need in order
Yeah.
to?
Is it something to be taken seriously?
I don't need to know if it's possible.
Yeah, no.
No, we do, Jim, we do.
Thank you, JV. So I think it's something to be taken seriously because this is the most fundamental mathematics I know about that describes supersymmetry. And so then the question that evolves, is supersymmetry an accurate description of something in our universe? I believe the answer is yes, but not because of the reasons that a lot of people have argued for the last 10 or 15 years. If you follow the physics literature, people were talking about using the LHC to find superpartners and all that stuff. I never believed that. And in fact, in 2006, I wrote a paper where I explicitly said that's highly unlikely to be the case. And so I was one of the few people who was willing to go out on the limb and saying the rest of the community is crazy. Now, I'm normally crazy, but in this case, they were crazy. And so we know how the first run of the LHC went. No superpartners were found. And so if you look at the physics literature now, there are lots of people who are sort of in despair. Oh my God, we can't find supersymmetry. Well, for people of my generation, the Standard Model was not the reason why we began to study supersymmetry. The reason my generation got to study supersymmetry is related to that measurement I described that's better than 1 in a billion parts agreement. In the measurement of the magnetic moment of the electron, you have to use quantum mechanics. It turns out that supersymmetrical quantum theories are more stable with respect to renormalization, which is a process that people like us use to try to crank out these extra digits that you saw in that. Supersymmetrical theories are the most quantum mechanically stable field theories that our species has ever found. And I have a very great suspicion that that's something significant. Yes, Maud's husband.
I'm Steve, by the way.
Also known as Maud's husband.
Do you think that you would be able, or someone would be able to find residual evidence of past universes that have a lot of evolutionary?
I don't know. No, actually, I don't think that that's the case. This comes, what you're talking about comes perilously close to what another interpretation of my work, which you can find on YouTube. A lot of people, and this is endemic and epidemic on YouTube, if you type my name in the word physics, you will almost invariably find a website that says, Jim Gates believes we live in the Matrix. The science fiction movie, The Matrix, right? And I don't believe that at all. But because this is error correction and it's related to computer science and information theory, a lot of people would like to put that spin on it, including my friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, by the way. I was on a panel with him a couple of years ago, and he just went way overboard, in my opinion. But I don't think so. I don't think we're going to find, and I could be wrong, but I don't think we're going to find the equivalent of, oh boy, I'm sorry, at 66 my mind is failing me. I only have a single active brain cell anymore.
The equivalent of a fossil?
Thank you! The word just couldn't come out. I don't think we're going to be able to find such a thing. I could be wrong, and I'd love to be proven wrong, but I don't think so. There's another hand. Gee, you folks are not.
Sorry. So along a similar line, when species go extinct, there might not be fossils, and you can't find the evidence for it, but all species go extinct. So in this evolutionary analogy, you could project into the future that it's finite.
Yeah.
So what is that? What is your model predict in terms of the longevity of the universe?
Sure. The work I'm doing has essentially nothing to say about that issue as I understand it, but there's cosmology that says a lot about that. And the current state of cosmology tells us because we live in a universe where the acceleration of the universe, where the expansion of the universe is accelerating, it says that we end in a heat death. That is that everything spreads out, stars slowly turn out.
So this theory does not address this.
This does not. This is something that looks at the other end. And I don't know. I don't understand how, in those circumstances, these things would be relevant. And from my thinking, these kinds of ideas about quantum stability and what have you probably apply to highly energetic and highly chaotic environments, whereas the heat death we're talking about is exactly the opposite of that. Uh-oh.
One last question.
Well, there's a mathematician asking a question.
So, I mean, in your view, is it that these other competing universes, that they all sort of came out at the same time and then they just spotted out?
I think that's
Like
the
multiple
one I'm most
bangs?
comfortable. That's the one I'm most comfortable believing now. Yes.
So we've come to the end of our session. Please join me in thanking. And looking forward to seeing you at the next one.